We're going to be doing communion today at the end of the service, and so I'm going to gear the message this morning towards communion, the Lord's Supper. There's a guy named Gregory Dix who was a liturgical theologian. And this guy lived back in the 1800s, but he found a fourfold pattern, he called it, the fourfold Eucharistic pattern. It was a fourfold pattern of communion. And he found it in the book of Luke and also some other places in the New Testament. And it's just absolutely fascinating. And other people have taken this and they've applied it to other things, like in worship, for instance, and even in the way we live our lives. A fourfold pattern. And it goes like this. It's take, bless, break, give. Take, bless, break, and give. And we see this 3 different times when Jesus interacts with bread in the Gospel of Luke. All right? So whenever you see Jesus and you see bread together in the same place, you find this fourfold pattern. Like, let's go to the Last Supper. That's the first one I'm going to do. In fact, when we do communion, we are remembering the Last Supper that Jesus shared with his disciples. And it's in Luke chapter 22. And they've gathered in an upper room, and Jesus is talking to them about how he's going to suffer many things. And then it says this in verse 19, and he took bread, and he gave thanks. He broke it, and he gave it to them. Do you see it? Take, bless, he gave thanks. He broke it, and he gave it to them. And he said, this is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Take, bless, break, give. If you go back just a few chapters to Luke chapter 9, you see it again. Now this one is where Jesus is feeding 5,000 people. He's been talking all day long, and they're out in a remote area, and there's no McDonald's anywhere near, or Zaxby's or anything like that, no drive-thrus, and so no Taco Bell, nothing like that. And so they're really hungry. In fact, the people are getting hangry. You ever get hangry? That's what they're just kind of getting irritated. And the disciples come to Jesus and say, okay, Jesus, listen, we got to do something about this. These people are getting really hungry. And then Jesus says, okay, you give them something to eat. They're like, us? We don't have anything. I don't have anything to give them. In fact, in one of the passages, when this story makes it in all 4 Gospels, and one of them says it would take like 6 months of salary just to feed them for one meal. Where's that going to come from, Jesus? Where's that going to come from? He says, you give them something to eat. And they said, well, all we've got are 5 loaves and 2 fish. In the Gospel of John, it says it was a little boy that brought that. There was just one kid who has a sack lunch, 5 loaves, 2 fish. And he gives it to Jesus, and then Jesus does something really cool with it. And so it says he has them all sit down, and then it says he took the bread, and he gave thanks. He blessed it, and he broke it, and he gave it to them. And every single person was fed, and there was plenty left over, 12 baskets full left over. Why do you imagine there were 12 baskets full left over? Well, different people have debated about that, different theories about that. This is mine. This is what I think what happened. Like 12, there's like one for every disciple, right? All the disciples have a basket full of bread and fish. And this little kid who shares his lunch, Jesus says, hey, kid, all right, remember how you gave us that? Well, here you go. You've got 12 baskets full left to go back and feed your village that you came from. So I'm going to send each of my disciples back with you. You lead the way. And so this kid's running home. He's running home. He's got 12 disciples, each one with a basket full of bread and fish. And they're coming, and the little kid's going, Mom, you're not going to believe what happened today. That's the way I picture it. And here's Jesus. Jesus took it, and he blesses it, and he breaks it. And then he gives it and feeds everybody, and there's plenty enough for everyone. I would call that the first supper, right? The first supper. And then actually there's a supper after the Last Supper. So maybe what we'd call the Last Supper is really the middle supper, and there's another one. And it's just a couple of chapters after the Last Supper. This is the last chapter of the book of Luke, Luke 24. It's after Jesus had died, And and everybody was confused, and there were some reports that maybe Jesus had risen from the dead. And there's this guy, his name is Cleopas. And Cleopas is walking down a road, he's taking a walk. You ever, like, when you're trying to think and figure things out, you just go on a walk, it kind of helps you sort it all out? Well, that's kind of what he's doing with a partner. We don't know who his partner was. Maybe it was Mrs. Cleopas. We don't know for sure who the other person was. But they're just walking, and a stranger comes along and meets them. Hey, what's going on? What are you talking about? Well, we're talking about Jesus, died, and it was just tragic, it was awful. And we had hoped that things would turn out so much differently. We had expected it to be a different way. It's not working out. It just didn't happen at all. And then Jesus, who is the stranger, it's really Jesus, but they don't know it yet. And he just starts unpacking all kinds of deep meaning and stuff. And they're like, oh, wow, that's really good. Wow, really? Oh, that's insightful. And then finally they end up at Cleopas' house, and they say, come stay with us. Come stay with us. And so Jesus comes in, and they sit down, they have dinner together, the Last Supper, if you will, the Last Supper in Luke. And then it says that Jesus takes over. Like, he's supposed to be the guest, but he becomes the host. Like, he's behaving very inappropriately here. Like, he reaches up, grabs the bread, and he takes it, and he blesses it. And then he breaks it. And then he gives it to them. And just as he's giving it to them, boom, he disappears. And they're like, oh, that was Jesus. That was Jesus. Didn't our hearts burn inside of us? That was him all along. And they ran back and they told the disciples. You see this pattern over and over and over again here in the book of Luke. Every time you see Jesus and bread, it's take, bless, break, give. And in John chapter 6, Jesus calls himself the bread of life. I am the bread of life. I am that. His whole life really is captured in this idea. Take, or maybe you could say chosen. Chosen. Like when Jesus came to this earth, he was chosen to come, to set us free, to be the example for us, to be our Savior and our Lord. He came, and born in that little manger, he was chosen for us. And he was blessed when he was baptized, and there's a voice out of heaven, this is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased. He's blessed. And when he dies on a cross, he's broken. He's just totally broken. But then, as he raises from the dead, he gives life. He gives life to everyone. Jesus, the bread of heaven. Take, bless, break, give. And if we are followers of Christ and he dwells in our hearts, then it's like we're little loaves of bread. That's what we're like. And for us, we too are chosen, that he takes us and he blesses us. Sometimes we're broken. He doesn't break us down. He just breaks us out. He breaks in, if you will. Satan breaks us down. Satan breaks in, and Christ breaks in, and he does a new and beautiful thing in our lives, and then gives. He sends us out to be a gift to other people. Take, bless, break, give. When we think about that first part, that we're chosen, that we've been taken, what a beautiful thing. See, he doesn't take our lives like against our will. We give it to him. He receives it. He says, I want you. He speaks to you. He says, I want you. I want you on my side. I want you on my team. But we give it. And when we give it, then he blesses it. That's how it works, see? Like, I just saw this recently with the rapper, right? Kanye West, who gave his life to Jesus Christ. He got saved. Now, I know there's some people there, I don't know, did he really get saved? I like him. He's like Kardashian, and I think we ought to just believe that it's true unless he proves otherwise. I think we ought to just bless that and quit being critical of him. I mean, you know what he's doing? It's just an amazing thing. Like he said, I'm not going to do secular stuff anymore. I'm all for Jesus. He just had a new album, King Jesus, Jesus the King. And what he said was, for the longest time, I was singing the praises of the highest fashion, the latest fashion. Now I'm going to sing the praises of Christ. That's what I want to do. But we should be praying for that brother, because here's what he did. See, he gave it. He gave him his life. He said, here it is, Lord. Here it is. I give it over to you. And God says, okay, I'm going to take it, and I'm going to bless it. You just watch. God's going to bless him. God's going to bless him because he did this. And there's a blessing. The word blessed. Blessed means happy. It means being grateful and happy. When Jesus gives the Beatitudes, he says, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek. He means happy are them, happy are them, happy are them. That when we offer ourselves up to God, he brings back a happy. He brings back a blessing. That's what he does. That's the way it works. He speaks blessing into our lives. And even the things that bring us most regret and most pain and most shame of our life into our lives, we take that and we give it to him. We offer it up to him, and he can take that very thing and turn it into a blessing. So there was a guy who was a seminary professor. He was making his way between Atlanta and up north somewhere, and he stopped off in Tennessee for a quick bite of lunch with his wife. They sat down at their table, unwrapping their sandwiches, and an older, distinguished-looking, white-haired gentleman comes up and just sits right down at their table with them, just plops right down there. He has his sandwich too. He says, so, are you traveling through these parts? And he says, well, yeah, we are. And he says, well, what do you do for a living? Well, I'm a seminary professor. I teach pastors in training. Oh, you are, huh? Well, I'll tell you what. I've got a preacher story for you. The guy says, here it is. This stranger just sitting down at my table and wants to tell me a preacher story. I wish he'd go away. But the guy starts telling his story. He said, there was this little boy who never knew who his daddy was. His mama had him out of wedlock, and there were several different people that could have been his dad, and she didn't know, and he never knew, and it was just a source of great shame, particularly back in that day and age and in that community. He said other kids made fun of him. Like at recess at school, they'd tease him. They'd say, who's your daddy, huh? Who's your daddy, huh? And he'd run and he'd hide, because he was so ashamed, because he couldn't say who his daddy was. And you know what happened? One day, his church got a new preacher. And that preacher, on the very first Sunday, he was like shaking hands with people out in the lobby area of the church. And this little boy comes up, and the new preacher puts his hand on that little boy's shoulder and says, well, hello there, son. And who's your daddy? He said, the little boy just shrunk back. And then the preacher, he must have realized instantly what was going on. Maybe it was God that helped him out. Maybe it was just he had good wisdom. But he realized he had just asked the wrong question. And then a light came on in that preacher's eyes. And the preacher said, oh, wait a minute. I know who you are. I know whose boy you are. Why, the family resemblance is uncanny. You're a child of the Most High God. That's who you are. And that little boy, he took that to heart. He took it to heart. The next time he was at the recess and the kids said, who's your daddy? Who's your daddy? Well, I'm a child of the Most High God. That's who my daddy is. And it changed everything for that little boy. And then the old man said, and if it wouldn't have been for that preacher, I seriously doubt if I ever would have made anything out of my life. And then he got up and he walked away. And the seminary professor, he went up to one of the waitresses and says, who was that? She goes, oh, you know, that's Ben Hooper. He was the governor of Tennessee. Who's your daddy? You see, in this place of shame, the Lord spoke blessing. Blessing. And whatever we offer up to him, he brings a blessing to it. Take, bless. But then the third word is break. And we don't like that one so much. Brokenness is not nearly as good as a blessing. But sometimes there's a blessing in the brokenness. And sometimes the brokenness comes first. But God always uses it. He can take the most broken things in our lives and he can put them back together again. Over in the other service, I pointed to the stained glass windows. Have you seen them as you drive through, or you've been inside over there? Stained glass window. Guess what? A stained glass window isn't a stained glass window unless it's broken. little pieces of broken glass, but they're put together into something really beautiful so that the sun shines through it and becomes a work of art. There's a blessing in the brokenness. One Sunday, I preached on brokenness. I had these floor tiles, bathroom floor tiles that I used as an illustration, and I had a hammer, and I talked about how we get broken and shattered by things, mistakes that we've made. Bam! Stuff that other people did to us that we didn't want, but it happened anyway. Bam! Terrible events that happened in our life that we didn't expect, and all of a sudden a tragedy happened. Bam! 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 Disappointment. Bam! Shattered it all into little pieces. And then I took those broken pieces and I handed them off to my friend Joan. Joan was a Native American artist. She had come to Christ in her life, and Jesus had taken the broken pieces of her life and had put it all together again. And she was just such a dear woman, full of love. And as I finished my sermon, she put the broken pieces together into a mosaic. Now, we had 3 services, so we did this 3 times, and she made 3 mosaics. Can we put the picture up? This is Joan and the mosaics. That's the next slide. There it is. There's her mosaics. And these mosaics, they now are the very first thing you see when you go into the doors of the church. And underneath it says, beauty from brokenness. The middle mosaic is I don't know if you can see it or not, but there's a cross. And right in the middle, that white bursting forth is like the holy love of Christ that's bursting forth out of the cross. And then if you look on either side, you can notice that all 3 of them together there's a circle. You see that? That represents the world. That would be all of us and our lives. And in the corners, there's like brown in the corners, each of the 4 corners. And that represents the shame, the regret, the sin, the brokenheartedness in our lives. And then the white that completely surrounds the earth is like the holy love of Jesus Christ that bursts forth from the cross, completely surrounds us and chases the darkness away. Beauty from brokenness. And when Jesus comes into the situation, he speaks his blessing into our brokenness, and it turns it all around, makes it completely different. He said, I make all things new. One Sunday morning, a friend of mine named Sandy came up to me. She said, Pastor, she goes, my dear friend Pam said she was going to come to church today with me. She had been promising me for weeks. Today was going to be the day she was going to come. But last night she was in a terrible car wreck and her neck was broken and she's in the intensive care unit. And I just want to know if you'd be willing to pray for her. And so we prayed together for her. And then I went to see her. That was about an hour and a half to the hospital. Well, we had a hospital in our town, but if you're sick, you don't want to go there. So there's another one, an hour and a half away you go to. And she was really bad sick. Her neck had been busted up. She couldn't move. Paralyzed from her neck down. And I walked into that intensive care unit. There she was in a striker frame, just all strapped up. She couldn't move. As soon as she saw me, she started to cry. I didn't know her. I had never met her, but she knew who I was. In a small town, just everybody knows if you're a pastor in a small community, and she knew me. And she knew why I was there, and she started to cry. She said, I was going to come see you this morning. And I said, well, I came to see you instead. And then one of us said something, and I say it one way, she says it another. And so since I'm telling the story, I'll tell it my way. She said, someday I'm going to walk into your church. She says that I said, someday you're going to walk into my church. I'm not sure exactly which one it was, but several months later, I was giving announcements, standing behind the pulpit, giving announcements about some women's ministry meeting, and all of a sudden the back door opens, and she comes walking in. Pam comes walking into the church like this. I mean, it was a hard walk, but she was doing it. She was walking in, and I just lost it. Here I am giving this announcement, and I started boo-hooing and blubbering, and the people couldn't figure out what was so moving about the women's ministry announcement. And And I just stopped everything and I told the story. This is Pam, and I met her in an intensive care unit. She said she's going to walking into the church. She was paralyzed. God has raised her up. Here she is walking into the church today. And they gave her a standing ovation. And it was absolutely beautiful. She marched right up to the front row and she sat down and she gave her life to Christ. It was so beautiful to see. She just went into warp drive spiritually. 1 year exactly to the accident. 1 year to the date. I baptized her. We're out at the lake shore, and she's getting ready to go into the water to be baptized. And I said, Pam, do you have anything you want to tell everybody before we baptize you? And she goes, yes. She goes, yes, I do. 1 year and 1 day ago, I was healthy on the outside, but I was broken on the inside. And today, even though I'm broken on the outside, I'm healthy on the inside, and I would rather take this than that any day. Oh, God used her life powerfully, wonderfully. She ended up going into recovery ministry, helping lots and lots and lots of people find freedom from addictions and stuff, the Celebrate Recovery type stuff, which is such a powerful, powerful ministry. That's what God did through Pam. You see it? Like, take, bless, break, give. I also saw it with my buddy George. Now, George was hunting, fishing, four-wheel driving, outdoorsy kind of guy. And George wasn't that old. I mean, like he was in his 50s. Okay, some of you college students, you think 50s is ancient. I know that. I know. And no, I wasn't on Noah's Ark or anything like that. But 50s is young to have a stroke. And that's what happened to George. He had a stroke. Ended up in a nursing home. Paralyzed, couldn't use his hands, couldn't walk anymore. His whole life ended up being inside of this nursing home room. But yet I saw George press into Jesus. Jesus had always been a part of his life, but when Jesus was the only thing he had left, it made a big difference. And George began to pray. He became a prayer warrior. So whenever I would speak, if at church on Sunday or if I traveled to speak somewhere, every time I'd speak, I would tell George, and George would be praying for me every minute while I was preaching. He'd be praying for me. One day I was talking to George, and he said, guess what? He said, tomorrow something amazing is going to happen. And I said, what's that? And he said, well, tomorrow's my birthday. And I was praying about it, and I asked Jesus if he would heal me for my birthday, and I think he said yes. Tomorrow, he's going to heal me for my birthday, and I'm just going to walk out of this place. Isn't that exciting? And I said, well, George, that's awesome if he'd heal you tomorrow. That'd just be the most coolest thing ever. But, like, what happens if he does it? And he goes, well, don't even say that because it's going to happen. I really believe with all my heart. I've got total faith, and it's going to happen. You just watch. You'll see. And the next day came. It was George's birthday, and the next day went. And God didn't heal him. He didn't heal him. I went to see George the day after his birthday. I had never seen a person so depressed, so distraught as George was that day. I mean, there wasn't any blessing anywhere that day. It was just all broken. Everything was broken. It was hopeless. He couldn't even talk. I tried to pray with him. I tried to read the Bible to him. It just felt like nothing was working, nothing. And he stayed that way for a while. Well, George and I have a buddy, another guy. His name is Jim. And Jim's an interesting character. He really is. He wanted to be a preacher early in his life, but he didn't become one. So, like, he ended up being a meat cutter instead. He was a frustrated preacher that became a meat cutter, and that's the way he lived his life. But he had this angst in him, always wishing that he could be a preacher, but he couldn't. And so he just kind of lived this kind of life. But he tried to put as much mission into everything that he could. Like, for instance, like he had this little grocery store with his meat cutting, and there was all this like stuff left over, like the fat and all that from the meat that was just waste and trash. And he came up with an idea, and he made soot balls for birds, and he hired a whole bunch of special needs people to come in, and so he started a brand new business called Just for the Birds, and it helped all kinds of people using stuff, leftover stuff, and helped the special needs people have jobs. It was really cool. I mean, that was the kind of person Jim was. He had creative ideas. And Jim said, I've got an idea for George. George is in a bad place, and he needs purpose. He needs mission in his life. He can't just live in the gloomies for the rest of his life. There's got to be something that he still has, even if Jesus didn't heal him on his birthday. And Jim came up with a great idea. He said, my daughter is a missionary in Zambia. And so he goes to George and he says, George, I want to know if you can help me. My daughter's a missionary in Zambia, and she's trying to raise some money for goats over there. Because these goats can help these grandmas over in Zambia, because these grandmas are raising their grandkids because their parents have died of AIDS. And if we could get some goats for them, they can milk the goats, they can sell the goats, they can have money and stuff, and that will just help them have a living, and then they'll be able to survive and stuff, and it would really help this village. And so, George, would you help me be able to get a few goats for these grandmas in Zambia? Well, that lit a fire for George. He perked up. The next time a nurse came in to change his bedpan, he says, hey, you want to buy a goat? It was $25 for a goat. So she left the room $25 later. And now he had his first goat. And then he thought, this is cool. And so like everybody that went into his room, every single person, he asked them to buy a goat. And if they weren't regulars, like the nurses and stuff, they saw them every day, they had to put boundaries around it because otherwise they'd go bankrupt. But anybody, like a social worker or any person visiting somebody else, in the nursing home, he'd hit them up for a goat. $25, you buy a goat. I started bringing people over just to visit George, just to get $25 out of them. And it was really cool. Like George sent money over then to Zambia. And then the people from Zambia sent a letter back with pictures of these grandmas and their goats and a big sign that said, thank you, George. And so we blew up the picture and ended up on the wall of his nursing home room. Thank you, George. Goats for grandmas. And then, oh man, he was on fire after that. It was absolutely unbelievable, the cool stuff that happened. By the time George died, he had a flock of over 2,000 goats over in Africa, plus 3 villages had wells because of the money raised for the Goats for Grandma. Goats for Grandmas morphed into something way bigger than just goats. I mean, there were chickens and ducks and wells and grinding machines and all of that. Just lifted the economy in several little villages in Zambia. And George did it all from his nursing home room. I had him on a video one time to my congregation. He says, I'm trying to make a difference in the world in Africa, and I want you to buy a goat from me. And from my nursing home room, I'm trying to make a difference in the world. What's your excuse? He said. When George passed away shortly before I moved here to South Carolina, I did his funeral. And we had several letters from tribal chieftains in villages in Zambia who talked about how George had really made an eternal difference in their lives. Pastors from churches in Zambia saying that people had come to Christ because of George, all the way over there from his nursing home room. You see, there was a blessing in the giving. Shortly before George died, Jim was visiting him one day. He said, George, I got a question. I know this is a hard question for you. But if you could go back and hit a reset button and you could have your old life back, hunting, fishing, four-wheel driving, physically fit, if you could have that life, or the one that you've got right now where you can't move, you can't walk, you're confined to a bed, but you're raising money for all these children in Zambia, which one would you take? And George says, that's a no-brainer. Are you kidding me? I would take this any day. This is it. This is it. This is where it's happening. I'm making a difference in the world. take, bless, break, give. Sometimes the blessing is in the breaking. And this brings us to communion, where Jesus took bread and he blessed it and he broke it. And then he gave it to the people that he loved. And he said, "This is my body broken for you." And we do this as we partake of it in remembrance of him.